The sky over Europe in 1943 was never silent. Imagine yourself standing on a muddy airfield in East Anglia at dawn. Frost clings to the edges of the runway, and the air is thick with the bitter smell of aviation fuel. A low rumble grows into a rolling thunder as four massive Wright Cyclone engines roar to life. Before you even see it, you feel it, like a heartbeat echoing across the fog. Rising from the mist, a dark silhouette emerges, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. German pilots called it the flying pin cushion. They laughed at the idea that any bomber could lumber its way over the Reich, daylight blazing, without being ripped apart by Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. To them, the fortress was nothing more than a slow, fat target, meat on the table. But that laughter would soon freeze in their throats. Pull closer. Picture a squadron of B-17s assembling into formation, their wings glittering like daggers in the morning sun. Each aircraft is bristling with machine guns, as if an iron porcupine had taken flight. 12, sometimes 13, Browning .50 caliber guns mounted in turrets, waist windows, and chin pods, each capable of spitting out death at nearly 900 meters per second. To a Luftwaffe ace diving in for the kill, those guns were not abstract statistics. They were streams of glowing tracers cutting through the sky, shredding aluminum and flesh alike. Now closer still. Inside the fortress, the smell changes: hot oil, gunpowder, sweat soaked into heavy leather jackets. The soundscape is deafening, engines droning at full throttle, the clatter of machine guns, the hollow thunk of flak bursts outside the fuselage. A waist gunner braces himself at his station. Frost has formed on his oxygen mask. He sees the sharp nose of a Bf-109 racing toward him. He squeezes the twin triggers, and twin barrels blaze with fire. In that instant, laughter vanishes. In that instant, the predator becomes the prey. This is not just a story of machines, but of young men, barely out of high school, who found themselves at 25,000 feet, trapped in flying steel coffins, fighting for survival against an enemy who underestimated them. It is a story of arrogance, of blood, of lessons learned the hard way in the frozen skies above Germany. So what truly happened when German pilots finally met the B-17 head-on? How did a lumbering fortress rewrite the rules of aerial warfare with nothing more than disciplined formations and the relentless bite of .50 caliber Brownings? And how did those lessons ripple into the very fabric of modern air combat? Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why the B-17 was more than a bomber. It was a message written in fire across the sky: laugh at your enemy long enough, and he will erase you. If this is the kind of deep, cinematic history you want more of, don't forget to subscribe, share this with a friend who loves aviation stories, and buckle in. The fortress is about to take off. Europe in 1942 was a continent under siege. From the English Channel to the Ural Mountains, warplanes carved contrails across the sky, and the roar of engines was as common as the toll of church bells. The United States had only recently entered the war, and with them came an audacious idea: daylight precision bombing. The British, scarred by unsustainable losses, had abandoned daylight raids, preferring the concealment of night. The Americans, however, believed in the power of the Norden bomb sight, in industrial choke points struck with surgical accuracy, and most importantly, in a machine that seemed too big to fail: the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The concept was both daring and controversial. High-altitude bombers flying in tight formations, each bristling with defensive armament, could, at least on paper, fight their way to the target without escort and deliver their payloads with devastating accuracy. The fortress was marketed not only as an aircraft, but as a doctrine in metal: self-defending, resilient, and relentless. This promise, however, would be tested in the unforgiving skies of occupied Europe. On the ground in Germany, Luftwaffe fighter groups watched the first incoming formations with a mixture of amusement and anticipation. Veteran pilots, many hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front, saw the B-17s as bloated targets. Reports circulated among squadrons: the bombers were slow, cumbersome, and could not possibly withstand concentrated fighter attacks. Like shooting at barns in the sky, one pilot joked in his diary. Yet these barns carried claws. A fortress bristled with 12 to 13 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns. Mounted in chin, tail, dorsal, ball, and waist positions, the guns could cover nearly every angle of attack. A single bomber might not be impregnable, but a dozen in formation could create a lethal crossfire, a defensive web that forced enemy fighters into narrow corridors of approach. 4 German pilots accustomed to slashing through Soviet bombers with impunity, this was an unpleasant revelation. Still, the statistics painted a grim picture. Loss rates during the early raids were staggering. Unescorted B-17 groups flying into Germany in 1943 often suffered casualties of 20% or more on a single mission. For the men inside those bombers, survival was never guaranteed. They strapped into flak jackets, checked oxygen systems, and scrawled messages to loved ones before takeoff. A single hit from flak could rip a wing apart. A burst of cannon fire from an FW-190 could turn a crew compartment into a coffin. Yet despite these horrors, the Americans pressed on. They believed that only daylight bombing could truly cripple the Reich's war industry, destroying ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, and refineries with pinpoint accuracy. The debate between British night strategy and American daylight persistence was more than a tactical disagreement. It was a clash of philosophies. Night offered concealment but scattered results. Daylight offered accuracy but demanded blood. In letters and journals, American crewmen wrestled with this reality. One waist gunner wrote, "We tell ourselves the guns will keep us safe, that the fortress can take it, but every time we fly, another friend doesn't come back." Another diary from a Luftwaffe pilot confessed a grudging respect, "They keep coming, even when we cut them down. The bombers burn, but more always follow. It is like fighting the sea itself." The problem was clear. Could the flying fortress truly fulfill its promise as a self-defending bomber, or was it a myth forged in American optimism? The Luftwaffe's laughter, after all, was not unfounded. Bomber crews fell by the hundreds, and formations were torn apart by disciplined fighter attacks. And yet, those same German pilots who laughed at the fortress soon learned the cost of underestimation. Every approach meant flying into streams of .50 caliber fire, and every kill carried the risk of not returning home. The B-17 represented more than just a machine. It embodied America's gamble on a new kind of air war. A war fought not in trenches or beaches, but in the high, freezing altitudes where men battled hypoxia, frostbite, and death raining from unseen clouds. The fortress was supposed to make the impossible possible, precision in chaos, survival in slaughter. But as the first waves of missions over Germany proved, the problem was not merely mechanical. It was human. Could green crews, many barely 20 years old, hold their formations under fire? Could machine guns manned by trembling hands create the overlapping zones of fire that theory promised? Could the steel belly of a bomber truly be an iron fortress against an enemy that had ruled Europe's skies since 1939? This was the dilemma of the B-17, a weapon both mocked and feared, both legendary and mortal. It was a plane that forced the Luftwaffe to rethink tactics, and it was an idea that forced the Allies to ask whether belief in the fortress was worth the lives it demanded. The laughter of German pilots would fade, but not without leaving behind a trail of fire, smoke, and shattered steel across Europe's skies. The context of the B-17 is not just its engineering, it is the blood that tested whether theory could survive reality. By the winter of 1942, Europe had become a continent where the sky itself seemed at war with humanity. Contrails slashed across the cold air in endless white scars, while the low moan of engines vibrated through villages and cities alike, a sound both terrifying and strangely routine. It was in this theater of constant noise and smoke that the United States introduced not only its manpower but its confidence, and with that confidence came a radical conviction that the Reich could be crippled not under cover of darkness, but in broad daylight, with bombs falling in precise patterns upon factories, rail yards, and oil refineries. The British had already abandoned such notions, convinced by their own bloody losses that daylight meant suicide. Yet the Americans, armed with the Norden bomb sight and a new machine called the B-17 Flying Fortress, declared that accuracy and firepower would triumph over fear. It was, in essence, a doctrine hammered into aluminum. The problem was not whether these vast aircraft could carry their loads across the channel. They could. The question was whether they could survive the swarms of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that waited with cannon and fire. The claim that the fortress was self-defending rested on three pillars: that formations could shield each other in a lattice of fire, that the .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun was a sufficient deterrent to any interceptor, and that the airframe itself was so robust it could carry crews home even when torn to pieces. To understand why German laughter at this flying barn eventually turned to grim respect, we must look at each of these foundations. Formation was the first shield. Alone, a B-17 was only a target, slow, ponderous, large enough to be seen for miles. But grouped into what became known as the combat box, the fortress transformed into something greater than its parts. 3 ships would fly in tight triangle, 3 triangles would stagger into a larger pattern, and when multiple squadrons stacked these boxes together, the sky became a moving fortress wall. Each blind spot of one bomber overlapped with the killing zone of another. A tail gunner firing down the throat of an approaching fighter not only protected his own aircraft but his wingman. Waist gunners could rake across entire arcs, their tracers joining into a collective curtain. The top turrets swept the heavens, the ball turrets searched the ground, and every gunner knew that his field of fire was not his alone, but part of a greater geometry of survival. Then came the teeth of that geometry, the Browning M2 heavy machine gun. Chambered in .50 caliber, it was not a weapon designed for subtlety but for overwhelming effect. Each gun spat rounds at nearly 800 per minute, streams of metal that carried both blunt kinetic energy and incendiary cores, capable of igniting tanks or shattering cockpits. Mounted in chin pods, dorsal turrets, cheek windows, and twin tail stings, these guns could, in theory, cover every angle of approach. Multiply 12 or 13 guns by a dozen aircraft, and suddenly the airspace in front of a formation was less a pathway and more a gauntlet of death. Luftwaffe pilots quickly discovered that diving into this gauntlet was not a test of skill but of luck, for every pass carried a statistical risk that no reflex could cancel. The joke about barns in the sky curdled when the barns spat fire. But the gun was only as strong as the hands that pulled its triggers, and here reality undercut theory. Crews were often no more than 19 years old, drawn from farms and cities across America, handed a crash course in gunnery, and then thrust into the frozen altitudes of Europe. Oxygen masks iced over, fingers numbed until they could hardly squeeze, and Browning belts jammed at the worst possible second. Training rooms could not replicate the chaos of black flak bursts or the shriek of a Messerschmitt barreling head-on. In those moments, it was not doctrine but desperation that decided whether a gun found its mark. Yet even when guns faltered, the fortress possessed one more quality: resilience. Engineers at Boeing had not built it for elegance but for endurance. Redundant hydraulics, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating around cockpits and critical systems. All of these made the B-17 less a machine of efficiency than a machine of survival. Tales quickly spread of bombers returning with wings half-shredded, tails dangling by rivets, noses blown away, and still somehow finding their way back to English soil. These stories, told in pubs and reprinted in base newsletters, became part of the fortress legend, a psychological shield that was as important as steel. If one bomber could make it home looking like Swiss cheese, then perhaps every crew could believe in their own survival. That belief itself was a weapon, though sometimes a dangerous one, for it encouraged commanders to send waves deeper and deeper into German territory, convinced that sheer toughness would compensate for tactical gaps. For the Luftwaffe, the fortress became both a nightmare and a proving ground. Veteran aces who had carved easy victories over the Eastern Front suddenly found themselves losing wingmen to bursts of .50 caliber fire. Diaries shifted in tone, from laughter about easy targets to grudging respect for a machine that could absorb punishment and still fight back like a cornered animal. They learned to adapt, to coordinate frontal group attacks that overwhelmed overlapping fire, to exploit blind spots, to strike when formations loosened. But even with these tactics, attrition mounted. The irony was bitter. The bomber that had been mocked as lumbering prey was now devouring the hunters, one tracer at a time. The resilience of the fortress was more than just myth, yet it carried limits that became painfully visible once missions pushed deeper into the Reich. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines could each deliver more than 1,000 horsepower, and the aircraft was capable of maintaining altitude even with 1 or 2 engines knocked out. Yet engines, like men, could not defy physics forever. A single burst of cannon fire from a well-placed Focke-Wulf 190 could tear a cylinder apart, ignite fuel lines, and send a fortress spiraling down in a trail of fire. Armor plate shielded pilots and gunners, but glass nose cones and thin aluminum skins remained vulnerable. The most dangerous predator of all was flak, those black blossoms of high-explosive shells that burst at preset altitudes, filling the sky with shrapnel. Unlike fighters, flak had no fear, no nerves to shake, and no chance to miss when entire corridors were saturated with fire. And yet, crews returned again and again. Part of that resilience lay in the machine's design, but part lay in the stubborn belief that the fortress was not merely steel but destiny. The Norden bombsight, a technological marvel that promised pinpoint accuracy, demanded daylight. That daylight condemned young men to face the Luftwaffe in honest combat, but it also became the justification for losses. Precision was not just a tactical choice. It was a moral one, a belief that factories, rail hubs, and oil plants could be struck without indiscriminate slaughter of civilians. To many, this belief was worth the blood. To others, especially those trapped inside the aircraft, it was a thin comfort against the reality of watching comrades fall from the sky. Technically, the Browning M2 was at the heart of this conflict. Designed during World War I, refined over decades, it was simple, robust, and devastating. Belt-fed, recoil-operated, air-cooled, it could keep firing until barrels glowed red. Ammunition belts often stretched hundreds of rounds, each one a potential line of fire that could cut through aluminum or flesh. When gunners spoke of their weapon, it was with both affection and fear, for the Browning was their only voice against the predators outside. Entire crews lived or died by the rhythm of those heavy machine guns, their chatter echoing inside the fuselage like a grim heartbeat. But the Luftwaffe was not passive. German tactics evolved rapidly once they recognized the nature of the threat. Head-on attacks, once considered suicidal, became standard because frontal armor was thinner and bombers were most vulnerable when focusing forward on targets. Packs of fighters would coordinate to dive through formations simultaneously, overwhelming gunners by sheer volume. Cannon shells, especially the dreaded 20mm and 30mm rounds, ripped through wings and engines with brutal efficiency. The introduction of heavy fighters such as the Me-110 and later the Me-410, armed with upward-firing cannons, created new nightmares. These machines could slide beneath formations, hidden from most gun arcs, and unleash devastating volleys into the bellies of the bombers. Against this backdrop, the fortress remained both miracle and gamble. It could bring crews home against odds that defied belief, but it could not by itself win the air war. The introduction of long-range escorts, especially the P-51 Mustang, would ultimately shift the balance by taking the fight to the hunters rather than waiting in defensive webs. Yet by the time those escorts arrived, the B-17 had already carved its reputation in fire. German pilots no longer laughed when they saw the box formations glittering in the morning sun. They gritted their teeth, tightened their harnesses, and knew that each attack might be their last. There is a paradox in the fortress story, one that reveals the essence of air power in that era. The bomber was at once vulnerable and indestructible, mocked as prey yet feared as predator, a machine that embodied both the fragility of human flesh and the stubborn strength of human will. Its guns could erase an ace in an instant, but its crews could be erased just as quickly by the unseen hand of flak. Its engines could roar with power, but its skin could peel away like paper under cannon fire. Its doctrine of daylight precision seemed like arrogance, but it became the seed of a strategy that helped strangle the Reich's industry. For those who lived it, the technical details were never abstract. The arc of a Browning, the angle of a formation, the reliability of a hydraulic pump, all of these meant the difference between returning to a hot meal in East Anglia or burning in a field outside Bremen. Engineers may have designed a fortress with mathematics and metallurgy, but the men inside knew it as a crucible, a place where youth and mortality collided at 25,000 feet. And for the Luftwaffe, each shimmering formation was both an opportunity and a warning. Every approach was a gamble, every victory came with the shadow of death. Thus the B-17 became more than aluminum and engines. It became a symbol, an airborne paradox that forced respect from enemies and demanded sacrifice from its own. The laughter that once greeted its silhouette was long gone. replaced by the sober knowledge that underestimating the fortress was a mistake that could cost even the most seasoned ace his life. In the end, its legacy lay not only in the bombs it dropped, but in the way it transformed the very psychology of air combat, proving that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not speed or agility, but sheer, unyielding defiance. The true measure of the flying fortress came not in hangars or manuals, but in the freezing crucible of missions that stretched deep into enemy territory. Each raid was not simply a line on a map, but a rolling drama of metal, fire, and human will. If the early missions of 1942 hinted at the promise and peril of daylight bombing, it was in 1943 that the concept was truly baptized in blood. One of the earliest proving grounds was the raid on the submarine pens at Bremen. In April of 1943, waves of B-17s lifted off from England, their engines beating the Dawn into submission. At altitude, the formations assembled into the combat boxes so carefully drilled in practice. The air seemed alive with glittering silver wings, sunlight reflecting from frost-covered fuselages. For the men inside, the routine was familiar: oxygen masks tight, ammunition belts checked, guns cocked and ready. The illusion of routine, however, shattered once the German defenses rose to meet them. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s cut through the sky with practiced aggression. The Luftwaffe had learned to mass their attacks, diving in from multiple angles in coordinated bursts. At Bremen, gunners reported fighters attacking in pairs and trios, cannon fire flashing like strobes against the icy backdrop. For every fighter cut down by streams of .50 caliber tracers, another slipped into the formation. Crews wrote in their journals afterward that the air itself felt predatory, alive with claws and teeth. And yet, the fortress formations held. Even as losses mounted, bombs found their way to the docks, sending geysers of water and steel into the sky. The Bremen raid was no decisive blow, but it demonstrated the pattern that would define the fortress experience: punishing losses paired with undeniable penetration of German defenses. If Bremen was a painful rehearsal, Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August 1943 became the defining tragedy and triumph of daylight bombing. The targets were not arbitrary. Regensburg produced Messerschmitt fighters, Schweinfurt manufactured ball bearings, the tiny steel spheres upon which entire war machines depended. To cripple either was to wound the Reich's war-making ability. To cripple both in one day was to strike at its industrial heart. The plan was audacious: a double strike launched in waves, one group hammering Regensburg before pressing onward to bases in North Africa, while a second force struck Schweinfurt and returned to England. The morning of August 17th dawned with flawless skies, the kind that promised both perfect visibility for bombing and perfect conditions for interceptors. As the Regensburg group crossed into Germany, they encountered swarms of Luftwaffe fighters rising to meet them. The combat boxes responded like living organisms, shifting to close gaps, gunners firing until barrels glowed. Witnesses spoke of air battles stretching horizon to horizon, hundreds of contrails weaving through black flak bursts. The fortresses reached Regensburg battered but intact, and their bombs fell across the Messerschmitt plants with chilling accuracy. Flames and smoke marked success, but victory was paid for in blood as the group continued southward without relief, harassed all the way to the Mediterranean. Crews landed in North Africa exhausted, aircraft riddled with holes, fuel tanks empty. They had struck a blow, but at a cost that gnawed at every survivor. Even as Regensburg burned, the Schweinfurt force advanced into its own storm. By then, German defenders had regrouped, and the bombers faced relentless waves of interceptors. It was here that the fortress myth met brutal arithmetic. Of the 230 B-17s dispatched, more than 60 failed to return. Losses approached 26%, an unsustainable rate by any measure. For crews who survived, the experience etched itself into memory as a vision of hell. A waist gunner later recalled seeing bombers explode midair, their silhouettes breaking apart against the blue sky like paper toys consumed by fire. Another described the smell of cordite mingling with the copper taste of blood in his mask as he fired until his guns clicked empty. Schweinfurt became both a legend of courage and a warning. Daylight bombing could bleed the 8th Air Force dry before it broke the Reich. Yet numbers alone cannot convey the paradox. In the midst of slaughter, the .50 caliber Brownings continued to exact their price. Luftwaffe records showed dozens of fighters destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Pilots who dove into the formations found themselves flying through rivers of fire, where probability itself became the deadliest weapon. Survivors confessed after the war that attacking a fortress box was not like fighting airplanes, but like flying into a storm where bullets fell like rain. Even as German pilots claimed victories, they returned to bases missing comrades, their own machines shredded by the guns they had once mocked. The paradox deepened when bombers returned home. Photographs taken on the tarmac at East Anglia showed aircraft limping back with holes large enough to crawl through, wings half shredded, noses blown away. Crews stumbled out shaking, some carrying the wounded, some silent with shock. The aircraft themselves became symbols, metal skeletons that proved resilience was not a myth but a cruel kind of endurance. For every fortress lost, another returned against impossible odds, validating the belief that the machine could, at least sometimes, cheat death. The raids on Bremen, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg revealed the heart of the fortress dilemma. Daylight precision could indeed strike deep into Germany, and the aircraft could indeed defend itself with terrifying firepower. But the cost was staggering, and the laughter of German pilots, though silenced, was replaced by something even more dangerous. Respect sharpened into tactical evolution. The Luftwaffe no longer underestimated the bombers. They studied them, adapted to them, and prepared new ways to bleed them. The fortress had proven it could fly to the target and back, but it had also proven that daylight alone was not enough. The war in the skies was far from decided. The lessons of Schweinfurt and Regensburg did not deter the 8th Air Force. Instead, they hardened its resolve. Losses that might have broken another command only seemed to fuel the conviction that daylight precision was not a theory to be abandoned but a battle to be won. As winter bled into spring, the target list expanded beyond factories and submarine pens to the very heart of the Reich, Berlin. To strike Berlin in daylight was more than strategy, it was a declaration. The capital of the Nazi Empire, the symbol of its strength and arrogance, would be challenged by formations of silver bombers that carried not only explosives but the promise that the Reich itself was vulnerable. On March 6, 1944, the first daylight raid on Berlin lifted into the cold air of East Anglia. Nearly 700 B-17s and B-24s clawed for altitude, escorted now by the long-legged P-51 Mustangs, whose arrival marked a turning point. The sky above Germany became a stage where thousands of men played roles in a drama of unprecedented scale. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled in waves, throwing themselves against the incoming tide, while gunners inside the bombers tightened their harnesses and whispered silent prayers. Berlin was far, the distance long, and the gauntlet brutal. Yet when bombs fell across railway yards and industrial targets in the German capital, the psychological impact was immense. The fortress, mocked as slow prey only a year before, had now carried its message to the very seat of Nazi power. The raid was costly. Dozens of bombers failed to return, and Luftwaffe fighters tore into formations with ferocity born of desperation, but the meaning was undeniable. Berlin had been struck in daylight, and it would be struck again and again. For American crews, the raid confirmed what many had already suspected, that the war in the air was shifting from a contest of attrition to one of endurance. The Browning .50s continued to do their grim work, but now the Mustangs and Thunderbolts carved bloody swaths through German interceptors before they could reach the bombers. The fortress was no longer alone. If Berlin symbolized defiance, Big Week, in February 1944, symbolized strategy. Operation Argument, as planners called it, was designed not only to damage German aircraft production but to force the Luftwaffe into the open, to bleed it white before the coming invasion of France. Day after day, waves of bombers surged into the Reich, hitting factories, airfields, and depots. The scale was staggering. More than 3,800 sorties across 6 days, supported by swarms of escorts. For gunners inside the B-17s, Big Week was both hell and vindication. Waste gunners wrote of constant firing, ammunition cans emptied, and the sky littered with the wreckage of both friend and foe. Luftwaffe pilots reported scenes of chaos, where dozens of aircraft spiraled down in flames at once, the sky itself choked with smoke and falling debris. Yet amid the slaughter, the strategic objective was achieved. German fighter production was disrupted, but more importantly, the Luftwaffe committed itself to battle and paid the price. Estimates suggested nearly a third of its frontline strength was destroyed in those few days. The fortress played its part not only as a bomb carrier but as a lure, a target so vital that German pilots could not ignore it. Each approach into the hail of .50 caliber fire cost them aircraft, pilots, and irreplaceable experience. For the crews of the B-17s, Big Week was remembered as both nightmare and turning point. Technical reports after the missions told of guns overheating, barrels warped, and oxygen systems freezing, yet crews persisted. Engineers back in England measured the shredded metal of returning bombers, cataloging damage to wings, fuselages, and engines. One aircraft returned with over 600 holes in its skin, yet still landed safely. The data was cold, the photographs clinical, but for the men who had lived it, the numbers carried faces. Each hole marked a moment when death had reached out and missed by inches. The transformation of the air war by early 1944 was not just mechanical but psychological. German pilots, once laughing at the clumsy Barnes, now faced an enemy that not only fought back but pursued them into their own skies. The fortress, when combined with escort fighters, became a spear that pierced the heart of the Reich's defenses. Berlin raids and Big Week revealed the shift. The Luftwaffe was no longer dictating terms. Every attack against a bomber box carried near-suicidal odds, and every fighter destroyed meant one less pilot to defend the homeland when the Allies crossed the Channel. From Bremen to Berlin, the fortress had proven that resilience was not an empty boast. It could bleed, it could be torn apart, but it could not be silenced. Its guns erased aces, its bombs shattered factories, and its very presence forced Germany to expend blood and steel at a pace it could not sustain. The war in the air had entered a new phase, and the laughter of 1942 was long gone, replaced by grim silence and the steady, relentless march of formations that no longer turned back at the border. The daylight raids on Berlin and the fury of Big Week marked a shift not only in the air but in the balance of the war itself. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer the untouchable predator that had dominated the skies of Europe. Instead, it was bleeding daily, losing machines faster than factories could replace them and losing pilots faster than training schools could graduate replacements. And yet, even in its decline, the German air arm remained dangerous. Each mission over the Reich was still a wager with death, each target another crucible. One of the most telling missions came in July, when the oil campaign became the Allies' obsession. It was no longer enough to strike at ball bearings or aircraft plants. Now the lifeblood of the German war machine, fuel itself, became the target. Without gasoline, tanks could not roll, aircraft could not climb, divisions could not maneuver. The 8th Air Force hurled its fortresses against refineries at Merseburg, Leipzig, and Palitz, missions remembered by crews as among the most terrifying of the entire campaign. The approach to Leipzig on July 20th was etched into memory with fire. The formations, stretched across miles of sky, were met by a concentrated storm of flak. Crews described the bursts as black, boiling flowers that filled the horizon. Each detonation hurled shrapnel through aluminum skins, severing control cables, puncturing fuel tanks. In the waste compartments, gunners crouched behind their Brownings as fragments rattled like hail against the fuselage. Then came the fighters, FW-190s and Me-109s clawing into the bombers despite the growing shadow of Allied escorts. The Germans knew what was at stake. Fuel was survival, and survival demanded sacrifice. What followed was a vision of chaos. Fortresses staggered out of formation, engines trailing smoke, yet the boxes held together long enough to release their bombs. Columns of fire rose from the refineries, proof that the Reich's lifeline had been struck. Losses were heavy, dozens of bombers gone, hundreds of airmen dead or captured. For survivors, the memory of Leipzig was not of victory but of endurance. One navigator later wrote that the mission felt like flying through the mouth of hell with eyes wide open. And yet, strategically, the raid mattered. German fuel supplies dwindled, forcing rationing, grounding training flights, and binding the Luftwaffe's hands tighter with every passing week. The oil campaign demonstrated a cruel arithmetic. A single refinery, once destroyed, could not be quickly replaced. Each raid inflicted a wound that bled for months. In this sense, the fortress and its relentless precision were more than just weapons. They were scalpels cutting into the arteries of the German war machine. Numbers told the tale. By autumn of 1944, German aviation fuel production had dropped by nearly 70%. What this meant in human terms was stark. Fighter squadrons once boasting experienced aces now sent into combat boys with barely a dozen hours in the cockpit, men who faced B-17 formations with courage but without skill, and who were cut down in droves by streams of .50 caliber fire. The irony was bitter. The same Browning guns that had once seemed a desperate last line of defense were now cutting through green pilots who had no chance. Crews reported engagements where Luftwaffe attacks felt almost clumsy, rushed, as if the predators had lost their edge. And indeed they had. Without fuel for training, without time to hone tactics, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to throwing flesh into the grinder. For bomber crews, this shift was palpable. Where once every mission felt like a coin toss with death, by late 1944 there were raids where escorts swept the skies clean before the bombers even reached their targets. Yet danger never vanished entirely. Flak remained as lethal as ever, indifferent to the decline of German fighters, and the fortress could still be torn apart in an instant by a lucky burst. The oil raids culminated in a paradoxical image. On one hand, crews returned with the confidence that the fortress was now the spearhead of a collapsing enemy defense. On the other, they knew that each mission still carried losses measured in blood. Photographs from East Anglia showed rows of empty bunks in barracks, chairs left vacant in mess halls. The machines may have been proving their worth, but the cost was human, and it was written in silence every evening when the roll was called and names went unanswered. By the time autumn winds swept across Europe, the Reich skies had changed irrevocably. The fortress had gone from mocked prey to relentless hunter, from fragile theory to proven execution. German laughter had long since died, replaced by grim acceptance. Every contrail over Leipzig or Merseburg was a signal that the Reich's strength was bleeding away. For the young men inside the bombers, however, the war was never abstract. It was measured in seconds spent firing a Browning until the barrel glowed red, in minutes holding formation as black clouds erupted around them, in hours waiting to see if the runway in England would ever come back into view. The raids on Leipzig and the oil campaign revealed the essence of the fortress's role, not to win glory in a single blow, but to grind down the enemy with the persistence of iron wings and disciplined formations. It was attrition elevated to strategy, precision turned into inevitability. And it was here, in the smoke of burning refineries and the silence of grounded squadrons, that the true end of Luftwaffe dominance began. By the winter of 1944, the Reich skies were no longer a fortress but a graveyard. The oil campaign had bled Germany's lifelines dry, and Big Week had shredded its fighter arm beyond repair. Yet the war in the air did not fade quietly. It reached its crescendo in firestorms and final assaults, with the B-17 still at the heart of the storm. The fortress had become more than a weapon. It was the relentless hammer that pounded until the anvil itself cracked. The most infamous chapter came in February 1945, when waves of B-17s and their British counterparts turned Dresden into an inferno. To American planners, Dresden was a strategic node, railways, factories, and communications hubs essential to sustaining German defense against the Soviet advance. To those on the ground, it became apocalypse. Thousands of tons of bombs fell in precision patterns, firestorms rising high enough to consume oxygen and create hurricane-force winds. Survivors recalled streets filled with flame, buildings collapsing in molten cascades, the sky itself glowing red. For the crews high above, the sight was different but no less haunting. Through their Norden bomb sights they saw a city dissolve into smoke, fire, and ash. Some believed they had struck a blow to end the war sooner. Others whispered unease that the line between military necessity and terror had blurred beyond recognition. Even as Dresden burned, Berlin remained a symbol that demanded destruction. By March and April 1945, the German capital was a shattered husk, but still the fortresses came. With Allied armies pressing from both west and east, the bombers hammered what remained of its rail hubs and industrial pockets. Luftwaffe defenses by then were shadows of their former might. Escort fighters often encountered little opposition, and when German aircraft did rise, they were flown by boys and old men pressed into desperate service. Crews described the engagements with an almost surreal sense of inevitability. enemy fighters approaching awkwardly, breaking formation under fire, vanishing in smoke before they could inflict real harm. The once feared predators had become prey. Yet even in those final months, the danger was never absent. Flak batteries still ringed Berlin, still capable of ripping apart a fortress in a heartbeat. Crews returning from missions in 1945 carried stories of friends lost not to fighters but to those silent mechanical bursts that cared nothing for the war's impending end. Bombers still returned with wings shredded, fuselages pierced, blood staining the floorboards. Victory never erased vulnerability. For the men who flew these final missions, the paradox of the fortress became clearest. They had begun the war facing laughter and disbelief from their enemies, flying machines dismissed as clumsy barns. They ended it commanding skies where few dared to rise against them. And through it all, the Browning .50s had remained their constant companions. Waist gunners spoke of firing less often in 1945, not because the guns had lost their power, but because there were fewer enemies left to fire upon. The silence in their gun positions was not peace but proof of exhaustion on the other side. The numbers themselves told the story with brutal clarity. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force had flown more than 290,000 sorties, dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs, and lost over 4,700 B-17s in combat. Tens of thousands of airmen never returned, their names carved into stone memorials or remembered only in fading letters home. And yet, in exchange, the Luftwaffe had been ground into dust, its aces killed or captured, its factories destroyed, its fuel reserves evaporated. The very strategy that many had mocked in 1942 had, by 1945, erased an enemy air force that once dominated Europe. Personal accounts underline this shift more vividly than any statistic. A German pilot, captured near the war's end, told interrogators that attacking a B-17 formation in 1945 felt like flying into the teeth of a machine that wanted to kill you before you even saw it. An American gunner, writing in his diary, described the opposite side of the same truth. We used to see swarms of fighters. Now we see them in 2s or 3s, and they die before they reach us. I don't know if that feels like victory or just the end of something broken. Thus the fortress closed its war not in laughter or mockery, but in silence. It had proven its doctrine through sheer persistence, a weapon of endurance that carried both hope and horror in its wings. The final missions were less about proving whether daylight bombing could work and more about finishing the war it had already reshaped. The B-17 had written its story in fire across Europe's skies, and when the Reich finally collapsed, the laughter of German pilots was not only gone, it was buried under the weight of their own losses, erased by the relentless bite of .50 caliber guns and the steel-willed formations that carried them. In the end, the fortress was not perfect, nor was it invincible. But it was enough. Enough to survive when others doubted, enough to fight when others laughed, enough to endure until the enemy could no longer rise to meet it. And that was its greatest victory. The war in the air was never fought by one machine alone, and the B-17's reputation must be weighed against its contemporaries. To American crews, the fortress was both savior and coffin, a paradox of resilience and vulnerability. To their British allies, who flew Lancasters in the cover of darkness, the doctrine of daylight precision seemed like an unnecessary gamble. And to the Luftwaffe, the fortress was first a target of ridicule, then a foe that consumed their strength with pitiless consistency. When compared to the British Avro Lancaster, the contrasts are sharp. The Lancaster could carry far heavier bomb loads, up to 14,000 pounds, and in special cases even the massive 22,000-pound Grand Slam earthquake bomb, while the B-17 typically carried 4,500 to 6,000 pounds on long-range missions. Yet the Lancaster paid for its payload with vulnerability. It flew at night, relying on darkness rather than firepower to survive, and its defensive armament was sparse compared to the bristling wall of Brownings on the fortress. Where the B-17 relied on daylight and gunners, the Lancaster relied on stealth and massed bombing, scattering destruction across cities but rarely striking with pinpoint accuracy. In the cold calculus of war, both approaches had merit, but each carried different moral and human consequences. The fortress killed factories with precision but sacrificed crews to daylight attrition. The Lancaster spared crews somewhat with the cover of night, but unleashed destruction indiscriminately upon civilians. Against the German Heinkel He 111 or Junkers Ju 88, the fortress seemed a monster. German bombers were designed for tactical strikes and blitzkrieg support, not sustained strategic bombing. Their armament was lighter, their ranges shorter, their defensive arcs limited. In truth, Germany never built a bomber to match the B-17, focusing instead on fighters and rockets. This imbalance forced the Reich to fight a defensive air war without the possibility of returning the same strategic pressure, a mistake that magnified the fortress's impact. Yet for all its strengths, the B-17 was not invincible. Its bomb load was modest, its speed slower than newer designs, and its reliance on formations meant that discipline had to be absolute. A single bomber drifting out of place was a dead man flying, cut apart before his comrades could cover him. The gun arcs overlapped beautifully on paper, but in reality, confusion, fatigue, and inexperience left gaps. Fighters that coordinated their attacks exploited these weaknesses. Frontal assaults, mass dives, and upward-firing cannon pods showed that even a fortress could be breached when the enemy adapted. The Americans themselves made mistakes that nearly doomed the daylight doctrine. Schweinfurt in 1943 remains the clearest example, sending deep penetration raids without sufficient escort, trusting that formations and guns alone could hold off swarms of seasoned Luftwaffe fighters. The result was catastrophic attrition, unsustainable for any force. Only the arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustang, capable of escorting the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, transformed the gamble into a sustainable strategy. Without those escorts, the fortress would likely have proven a failure. On the German side, mistakes compounded fatal weaknesses. The first was underestimation. In 1942, pilots laughed at the clumsy bombers, expecting easy prey. They underestimated the resilience of the airframe, the reach of the Brownings, and the discipline of American crews. By the time they recognized the cost of frontal attacks into a storm of .50 caliber fire, they had already lost irreplaceable aces. The second mistake was strategic, investing resources in wonder weapons and V-rockets instead of focusing on long-range bombers or sustainable pilot training. By 1944, fuel shortages and inadequate training produced waves of inexperienced pilots thrown against veteran American crews and escorts. The skies became slaughterhouses, not for the bombers but for the defenders. The fortress itself carried lessons in paradox. Its strength, defensive firepower, was also its weakness. Gunners firing from multiple stations often created blind arcs of tracers, wasting ammunition, sometimes even endangering other bombers. Coordinated defense required nerves of steel and communication that was difficult at 25,000 feet with oxygen masks freezing over. Flak, the silent killer, remained outside the scope of the fortress's defenses entirely. Crews joked grimly that you could fire all 12 Brownings into the sky and still never hit a single flak shell. In truth, most losses came from those black blossoms of steel, indifferent to bravery or training. When seen against the backdrop of strategy, the greatest mistake was perhaps not mechanical but philosophical. The United States believed daylight precision alone could cripple the Reich quickly. The reality proved far bloodier. Success only came when the fortress was integrated into a larger system. Long-range escorts, relentless industrial pressure, and the attritional grind of men and machines. Alone, the B-17 was not a war winner. Together with doctrine and support, it became the spear point of a strategy that eventually strangled the German war machine. For the Luftwaffe, the mirror lesson was harsh. Air superiority cannot be sustained by fighters alone. Without the industrial depth of a true strategic bomber fleet, without fuel to train its pilots, and without the humility to adapt earlier, Germany found itself in a losing battle of attrition. The fortress did not destroy the Reich by itself. Rather, it forced the Luftwaffe into a fight it could not afford, draining strength until collapse became inevitable. Thus the story of mistakes on both sides intertwines with the story of comparison. The fortress was neither the best bomber of the war nor the heaviest hitter, but it was the right bomber at the right time. It embodied endurance, discipline, and technological balance in a way that turned ridicule into respect. Its opponents, blinded by arrogance and hamstrung by poor strategic choices, allowed it to transform from prey into predator. And in the final tally, those mistakes proved fatal. The echoes of the B-17 did not fade when the war ended in 1945. Its legacy lived on in burned cities, in shattered factories, and in the silence of families who waited for men who never came home. Yet it also lived in the doctrines, technologies, and myths that reshaped the future of warfare. The fortress was more than a machine of aluminum and rivets. It was an idea made manifest, and its consequences stretched far beyond the battlefields of Europe. The most immediate consequence was strategic. The daylight bombing campaign, for all its losses, proved that industrial heartlands could be reached, penetrated, and crippled from the air. Factories that once churned out Messerschmitts and tanks were reduced to rubble, supply chains fractured, and oil refineries burned. By the last year of the war, German divisions often stood immobilized, not because of defeat in battle but because trucks and tanks lacked fuel. For every fortress lost, dozens of panzers sat idle, dozens of aircraft never left their hangars. The air war had become a slow strangulation, and the B-17 was its garrote. The human cost, however, was staggering. More than 26,000 American airmen in the 8th Air Force were killed in action, a casualty rate higher than that of the U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific. Every mission carried with it the knowledge that friends might vanish in smoke, and many did. The photographs of grinning young crews taken before their first sorties are matched by the empty spaces in squadron group photos at war's end. For survivors, the memories never faded. Diaries and memoirs describe dreams haunted by flak bursts, by the smell of burning oil, by the sight of parachutes blossoming too close to enemy soil. In this sense, the fortress carried not just bombs but generations of trauma that lasted long after the last mission was flown. Technologically, the B-17 left fingerprints across decades of aviation. Its reliance on heavy defensive armament influenced bomber design through the end of the war, though later experience would show that speed and stealth eventually outweighed gun turrets. Its redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, multiple hydraulics, and armor-plated cockpits, became benchmarks for survivability in modern aircraft. The idea of formation flying as a defensive weapon faded with the arrival of jet interceptors, but the principle of mutual support lived on, evolving into the concept of combined arms in the air. Bombers, fighters, and electronic warfare platforms integrated into a single, coordinated strike package. The Norden bomb sight, which demanded daylight and precision, seeded the philosophy of accuracy that would later drive Cold War doctrines. Though the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki overshadowed all other air campaigns, the logic of precision remained. Strategic Air Command, with its fleets of B-29s and later B-52s, carried forward the belief that wars could be won by striking the enemy's industrial and military heartlands. The B-17, in this way, became the prototype not just for bombers but for the very concept of air power as an independent, decisive force. There were cultural consequences, too. The fortress entered popular memory as a symbol of resilience. Newsreels showed bombers limping home with tails shredded, wings torn open, crews cheering as they stepped back onto English soil. These images fed morale during the war, but they also created a mythology that persisted afterward. The flying fortress became shorthand for toughness, for the idea that courage and engineering could defy impossible odds. Films, novels, and documentaries repeated the stories of aircraft that returned with gaping wounds, of gunners who fought until their guns ran dry. In truth, many did not return, but the myth was necessary, perhaps even merciful, for a society that needed meaning in the face of such staggering sacrifice. For Germany, the consequences were equally profound. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the attrition forced upon it by B-17 formations. The loss of experienced pilots created a vacuum that no amount of youthful enthusiasm could fill. By the time of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the Luftwaffe could mount only token resistance, its squadrons depleted of both machines and men. Strategic bombing did not win the war alone, but it ensured that when Allied armies crossed the Rhine, they faced a hollowed-out enemy with no air cover and crippled logistics. The fortress, mocked at first, had helped to ensure that German soldiers on the ground fought with dwindling supplies, limited mobility, and skies filled with hostile contrails. Looking beyond the war, the B-17 influenced not only aviation but politics. The belief that industrial bombing could shorten conflicts fed into Cold War strategy, shaping doctrines of deterrence and preemption. Yet it also sparked ethical debates that continue today. Dresden, Hamburg, and other firebomb cities raised questions about the morality of bombing campaigns, about the line between military necessity and civilian terror. The fortress stood at the heart of these debates, its Norden bomb sight promising precision while its bombs sometimes fell wide, killing thousands who were not soldiers. The myth of precision clashed with the reality of war's chaos, a tension that still shadows the use of air power in conflicts from Vietnam to the Middle East. There was also a quieter legacy, written not in doctrine but in memory. Veterans who returned carried with them a bond forged in fire. Reunions decades later showed men now gray-haired, but still waist gunners and navigators at heart, recalling the cold of altitude, the chatter of Brownings, the fear of black flak clouds. Museums across the world preserve B-17s, their rivets polished, their fuselages silent, yet for those who know the history, the silence is heavy. To stand beside a fortress today is to feel the weight of thousands of voices, some that came home, many that did not. The long-term impact of the B-17 can perhaps be summarized in a paradox as sharp as the machine itself. It was a bomber that proved both the power and the limits of strategic air war. It showed that industry could be strangled from the sky, but it also showed that precision came at terrible human cost. It demonstrated that resilience could turn ridicule into respect, but it also revealed that resilience was never invincibility. And it seeded doctrines that promised future wars could be won by machines, while leaving behind memories that whispered of the irreplaceable human price. Thus the fortress lives on not only in museums and films, but in the very way nations think about war. It is present in every debate about strategic bombing, in every calculation about acceptable loss, in every moral question about civilians caught beneath the bombs. Its engines are silent now, its guns no longer thunder, but its legacy continues to shape the skies, and the choices of those who command them. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress is a story of contradiction, of courage set against vulnerability, of mockery transformed into respect. When the first formations droned across the English Channel in 1942, German pilots laughed at the thought of lumbering barns trying to challenge the Reich in daylight. But laughter turned to silence, and silence turned to fear, as .50 caliber Brownings carved glowing arcs across the sky and formations of fortresses ground down the Luftwaffe's strength day by day. The lessons written in fire above Europe remain sharp even now. The first is that technology alone cannot win a war. The fortress was brilliantly engineered, with redundant systems and unmatched defensive armament, but in its early days it bled heavily when doctrine outpaced reality. Only when combined with escorts, intelligence, and coordinated strategy did the B-17 achieve its potential. This truth, that no machine is invincible alone, remains as relevant in the jet and drone age as it was in 1943. The second lesson lies in resilience. The B-17's reputation as a machine that could absorb incredible punishment and still limp home gave its crews hope when hope was scarce. Hope is not measured in rivets or horsepower, but in the belief that survival is possible. That belief kept young men steady at their guns, formation tight under fire, missions pressed forward even after losses. Resilience, both mechanical and human, proved decisive. The third lesson is more sobering. Strategic power carries moral weight. The fortress was built for precision, yet in practice bombs sometimes fell wide, and cities burned. Dresden remains an open wound, a reminder that even when technology promises accuracy, war has a way of turning intent into devastation. The doctrine of daylight bombing helped win the war, but it also blurred the line between military necessity and human cost. The lesson here is humility. That power wielded from the sky must always reckon with what lies beneath it. For the Luftwaffe, the B-17 delivered a brutal education. Never underestimate your enemy. Confidence turned to arrogance, arrogance to tragedy, as aces dove into formations and never returned. For the Allies, the lesson was equally sharp. Conviction is not enough without adaptation. Early missions proved that doctrine alone could kill as surely as enemy fire. Victory came only when mistakes were faced honestly, when escorts stretched across the Reich, when formations were disciplined, when strategy became a system rather than a slogan. Today, when one walks beneath the wings of a preserved fortress in a museum, the silence is deceptive. These machines once shook continents, their engines a thunder that changed history. Yet the silence now is not emptiness. It is heavy, filled with voices that remind us of sacrifice, of courage, of the fine line between defiance and destruction. The B-17 is no longer a weapon of war, but it remains a mirror, reflecting lessons that every generation must choose whether to remember or forget. And so, the final lesson may be the simplest. Never laugh too quickly at what seems slow, clumsy, or outdated. Underestimation is the oldest mistake in war, and the fortress proved it can be fatal. German pilots laughed, and the laughter was erased in streams of .50 caliber fire, in the roar of engines that would not be silenced, in the contrails that stretched all the way to Berlin. If you've stayed with us through this cinematic journey into the frozen skies of Europe, I invite you to keep exploring history with us. Subscribe to this channel for more deep, immersive stories where machines, men, and choices collide. Share this video with friends who love aviation or history, and let us know in the comments what lessons you think the fortress still teaches today. History is not just past, it's the story we carry forward. And together, we can make sure these voices are never forgotten.